Good afternoon. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece on May 3rd, 2024. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Vijay Prashad. Vijay is a historian, author, journalist, political commentator, and Marxist intellectual. He's the executive director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, editor of Leftword Books, chief correspondent at Globetrotter, and a senior non-resident fellow at Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University of China. And I must say, Vijay, I just want to convey to you, because I finally had the opportunity to do it, nowadays we're all so busy that I've begun to be very selective in terms of who I watch and listen to on YouTube, because it was taking up so much of my time. And the criterion that I adopted was who is teaching me things that I don't already know. And every time I listen to you speak, I realize just how ignorant a human being I am, because I always learn all sorts of valuable information that I didn't know. And so I'm so happy to finally have the opportunity to interview you. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me.
You're very kind. You're very kind. And this is a terrible way to begin our conversation, because now I'm feeling completely embarrassed, but okay.
You shouldn't. It's the comment is well-deserved, I assure you. So, Vijay, the reason why I've asked you to speak with me today is because I want to explore with you, broadly speaking, the question of whether Western states, and focusing particularly on the United States, but not only the United States, are descending into fascism. Because from my perspective, there are some very, very troubling signs. And the immediate reason that I wanted to take this subject up with you is the brutal suppression of the peaceful protests against Israeli genocide on university campuses across the United States. But that brutal suppression is only the immediate reason. This is all happening in a broader context that is deeply troubling. So, for example, we've seen the aggressive suppression of dissent in Germany, France, and Britain. Weeks ago, the German government barred former Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis from entering Germany and even from participating in speaking events remotely via Zoom. In addition, Western states continue to support Israel's genocidal regime in every conceivable way, militarily, economically, and politically, and they are doing so even after the International Court of Justice ruled more than 3 months ago that it is plausible that Israel is committing genocide. And we also are seeing troubling signs of a more symbolic nature. So, for example, in Canada, where I spend much of my time, we had the Canadian parliamentarians in September of last year giving 2 standing ovations to a Ukrainian Canadian who had served in the Galicia division of the Waffen SS during World War II voluntarily, and who boasted about that fact publicly. We have Western states voting repeatedly in the United Nations General Assembly against a resolution condemning the glorification of Nazism. We're seeing military spending in the West already at stratospheric levels soar to ever higher levels. And so all of this is the context in which I wanted to have this discussion with you. But before we jump into it, I'm interested in your thoughts about what actually is fascism, because this is a word that is bandied about quite a bit nowadays, sometimes in contexts which it may not actually be applicable. In your view, what is a proper understanding of fascism?
Yeah, so let's first go back to classical fascism, where the term is first used. It's used in reference to the intervention into state government in Italy of the party led by Benito Mussolini. That's where the first use of the word fascism takes place. And then, classically, it's used to describe the Nazi takeover of power after 1933, when they sort of, forcibly took over the German parliament. And that was the Nazi party led by Adolf Hitler. So Hitler and Mussolini, to some extent, Franco of Spain and so on, are the figures of classic fascism. So what is classic fascism? A couple of things. Firstly, classic fascism emerges in a certain context. It's a context in which the workers' movement, the communist movement in particular, after the Soviet Revolution of 1917, after these revolutions, this strength of the workers' movement begins to put pressure both on the state, as it were, in places like Germany, Italy, but not just there, also France, the United Kingdom, but also put pressure on bourgeois society, society that is largely dominated by a class that owns property and so on, the bourgeoisie. So classical fascism is seen as an answer to the rise of the workers' movement, the rise of the communist threat. And so the bourgeois society and the state, in a sense, welcome the setting aside of the norms of statecraft, particularly the constitution, and the entry of these forces on behalf of the people of property against the workers' movement, against the communists. In many cases, in fact, in Germany, as an example, the fascists come to power through bourgeois norms. They don't actually overthrow the government when they first win elections. They win elections and enter parliament. They enter the Reichstag. When the Reichstag, and in Italy, when the Italian parliament is unable to help them fulfill their aims of destroying the workers' movement, of narrowing the communist threat, then they set aside the constitution and they seize power by force. So they come into power, they adopt some of the demands of the workers to build a mass base. You know, they adopt certain welfarist demands and so on. But in both the cases of Italy and France, they effectively disarticulate the workers' movement, smash it up, weaken the workers' movement, and allow property to be strengthened. That's actually what I understand as classic fascism. In our period, it's a very different kind of right-wing movement. Firstly, neither the workers' movement is strong now. That is not the case in any of these countries, United States, Canada, France, Germany, Italy. The workers' movement is simply not strong. Secondly, there is no communist threat. I mean, you know, in the United States, the right wing depicts Joe Biden as a communist. That's how ridiculous things are. There is no communist threat. So the context of neo-fascism or today's fascism is very different than the context of classical fascism. That's something people need to take seriously. So now that requires you to try to understand what is the context of the rise of neo-fascism. I would like to suggest that we look, in fact, at the material realities that confront these states. The first setting of the context is the exhaustion of the neoliberal agenda. In all these countries, neoliberalism became effectively the main policy framework from the early 1990s onward. And what the neoliberals did was that they effectively allowed the very rich to no longer pay taxes. This is the case in all the group of 7 countries. They said, you guys don't need to pay tax. You can keep your tax wherever you want, including in illicit tax havens. So trillions of dollars, and I mean trillions, tens of trillions, vanish into illicit tax havens. That's the first thing. This means these governments, neoliberal governments, didn't have access to wealth. So these governments then turn to the next best thing, which is they cannibalize their own society. They sell off public assets, they commodify areas of social life, and so on. But this is not to create growth. This was merely to allow the societies to keep functioning at the very high level that they were. You know, you want to have decent public services, but you don't want to pay for them. So you cannibalize the state in order to pay for them in the short term. It's a very short-sighted policy. Also, they allowed for, and this was thanks to new forms of technology, satellite technology and so on, they allowed firms to basically break up factories and take them all around the world, and then left workers in the G7 countries, United States in particular, but also other countries, Germany, France, and Italy, United Kingdom. They created factory deserts and effectively left people with very precarious employment options. So this is the context, this neoliberal detritus is the context upon which neo-fascism emerges. So what is the next part of the context? That's part one. Part two of the context is in this period, as a consequence of globalization, that's the irony of this policy, countries in the global south start to grow because they start to become the hubs of industrialization. Countries in Asia, China, Indonesia, India, and I'm not saying that they don't have inequalities and so on. It's just that industry moves in that direction. Brazil is another in South America. These countries start to have high growth rates. The United States and its G7 allies enter a long-term slump. We call that the Third Great Depression, which starts with the US housing crisis, but continues till today. Meanwhile, you've got these countries rising in Asia, China, India in the lead. And what you begin to see is that these countries, particularly China, develop a project for the world called the Belt and Road Initiative. None of the countries in the West have either the resources or the ideas for a new development agenda. So they actually begin to lose in terms of global reputation. The decline of their own societies, the decline of their global reputation, the fragility of their own hold on the planet, and so on, is the combustive elements, these two elements, combustive elements for the politics of the global north. And these two elements, neoliberalism and the detritus it creates, and the declining political and economic power of the West or the global north in the rest of the world, these two elements produces a kind of civilizational crisis in the global north. Now, Canada is a little immune from this because Canada has not really always made its wealth through industry. It's made its wealth through bringing in the rent from mining companies. Some 60% of the world's mining companies are domiciled in Canada, especially things like Barrick Gold and so on, wretched companies. So it was slightly immunized from this, but not entirely immunized from it. This combustive problem, neoliberalism, its detritus, and then the fragility of control over the world set the terms for the arrival of a new kind of right. On the one side, this right wing very correctly identifies the immense social crisis in their societies. You know, people just not able to get jobs of any decency and so on. So they talk about that. This is the right in Germany, in Italy. They are more forthright in raising these issues than the parties of the former neoliberals who are responsible for this. You see, these people can talk about it because they don't claim responsibility for it. So it's not the normal Republicans who are the new right. It's the Trump people who come after neoliberalism's detritus. And secondly, they start to directly either confront the Chinese with a very belligerent rhetoric, or they talk about the need to understand the world. Like, let's talk to the Russians, let's talk to like Trump is an emblematic figure in that. So the neo-fascism has very little in common with the old fascism. Where it is united with the old fascism is it's uninterested in liberal freedoms, freedom of expression, rights, and so on. Both of them are uninterested. The great difference is that I actually don't believe that the neo-fascists need to subvert the constitutions. The reason is that over the course of the last 100 years, since classical fascism's rise in this period, the constitutions have themselves become illiberalized. So if you look at the US rules regarding protesters, very little that the police is doing now is illegal. It's all legal. What they're doing in Germany is all legal. What they're doing in Italy is legal. What they do in Canada is legal because they have already liberalized the constitution. So you actually don't need to overcome the Constitution, which is why I believe that the current neo-fascism has an intimate relationship with the neoliberals. They are actually peas of a pod, in a sense. They rely on each other. This is not Hitler. It's worse than that. Because this, you don't need to burn down the Reichstag. You take power stealthily.
So may I take it from your interesting elaboration of the concept of fascism and neo-fascism that you would regard it as fair to characterize the United States of today as a neo-fascist society? And if you disagree with that, or if you think elements of neo-fascism have not yet come to fruition, why do you have that view?
Well, firstly, let's do the easiest thing. I believe there's a neo-fascist political project. It is in the gap between Trump and his political forces and the neoliberals, including Biden and so on. Because after all, it's not Trump that is sending in the police to go and break up these encampments. It's often, mayors of the political party of Mr. Biden, the mayor of New York, as an example, so-called liberal mayor. So I think in the United States, the political parties are already in some ways committed to neo-fascism. I don't think societies, even in Europe, are actually given over to a neo-fascist sensibility. I think in society, there's a kind of contest. So take the case of Germany, which is really the flashpoint of much of this. I think within Germany, there is still an unadmitted consensus in society around all kinds of opinions. I think that there are lots of people who are pro-Palestinian in German society. But I think the German state has by and large adopted a neo-fascist position regarding, let's say, the question of Israel and Palestine. So I think that in the United States, in Germany, places like that, the political class has by and large gone over to a neo-fascist agenda. I think society is still torn in a debate and discussion. So even in the United States, even polling data shows that very large numbers of people are against the US support for the Israeli government, even in the United States, which shows you that in the United States, the society is at a different place than the political class. And within the political class, it has by and large gone over to a neo-fascist agenda. It's not an issue of Trump. You see, that becomes the red herring, that this is a Trump problem. Trump is just a symptom of a certain bad, masculine formation in the US, a certain racialized masculinity, which has its own problems. It's been there in fraternities in the US for generations. Every once in a while, a frat boy becomes president. George W. Bush was very similar to Donald Trump in many ways. And when you go back, George H.W. Bush was himself quite a barbarian when it came to many of his social attitudes. Go back further to Richard Nixon, working class fraternity boy, and so on. Look, this Trump surprise at Trump is a little bit exaggerated. Why were people not worried about Obama when he was drone attacking even US citizens overseas? Because Obama didn't fit the sociological profile, and he was such a charming and elegant speaker. He didn't fit, but that's to personalize politics. Yes, politics is very much personalized. Look, you see in Canada that for a long while, and even now, I think it's Justin Trudeau's demeanor that wins him a certain amount, and the fact that he's the son of old Trudeau that wins him some, continued support from people, that he doesn't come across as stupid and brutish like Stephen Harper, who came across as brutish and unfeeling and so on. And Stephen Harper's father was not old Mr. Trudeau. These personal things play a role in politics in the modern era, but underneath that is a kind of political traditions and tendencies that one must look at. And if you look in the United States, it's really a large swath of the ruling elites of the United States, including the elected officials, that have already by and large gone over to neo-fascism. I mean, just a handful of people, elected officials, I mean, have come out in public to defend the students and to attack the way they are being brutalized. You know, Dimitri, when the head of Jewish studies at Dartmouth University is arrested and then banned from the college, you know, she is the head of Jewish studies. I mean, what is going on? I mean, how can you accuse her of anything but decency when she tried to defend the students? The videos are circulating online. All that she comes out there is to tell the police, listen, you can't behave like that. They throw her on the ground, they arrest her. Okay, that's the police in the heat of the moment. You know, you could have them, but university administrators who have access to the videos, they know her work. They've given her the chair position of Jewish studies and so on. After all of that, that they ban her from campus, I don't blame the police. They are in the heart of the moment. They have a terrible job. But the administrators, after some time, decide to ban her from campus. That's as bad as the German government. Okay, you don't want Yanis to come in person, you're scared of him or whatever, but he's not allowed to not only come on Zoom, but even to have them broadcast a video he is pre-recorded. Even that is illegal by the ban order. I mean, this is the ruling class being neo-fascist. So you see, when one says, oh, well, Trump is the neo-fascist, Biden is the... No, that misunderstands the way politics operates through a state. If the ruling sections behave in a certain way, one should call them what they are. I mean, this is a decidedly illiberal decision to ban the professor from Dartmouth or to ban Yanis from even sending a video pre-recorded. That is a decidedly illiberal decision, violates all the basic premises of liberalism. So then what is it if it's not liberalism? It is certainly very much leaning in the direction of fascism. You know, I'm not one of those people that says, well, this is what liberalism is. You know, liberalism is a bunch of hypocrisy. I think that's a very wrong thing, because the fact is that liberal ideals are important, and I'm not opposed to liberal ideals. I might believe something beyond them, but I don't want to characterize liberal ideals as somehow stealth fascist ideals. Fascist ideals are real. Fascist ideals are no freedom of speech. Liberal ideals are you have freedom of speech. We want to enhance and go beyond liberal ideals, not to denigrate them. You see, it's these people, Olaf Scholz and others, who are denigrating liberal ideals because they are neo-fascists. And in saying that, we are already violating the law in Germany, by the way, in saying that they are neo-fascists.
Well, I'll not be crossing the German border anytime soon, Vijay. Thanks for enlightening me about that. I want to address this, narrow in on the subject of free speech in particular. I've long thought that even amongst the progressive communities in the West, there are certain what I call Western supremacist mythologies prevailing. One of them has long been, in my view, that we have higher levels of free speech in the West than you find in the so-called authoritarian states, which nowadays are primarily alleged to be Russia, China, and Iran, the official enemies of the West. Do you think that there could any longer be any plausibility to that claim in light of what we are now witnessing? Can we say with any credibility whatsoever that we have higher levels of free speech in the West, and particularly the United States, than you see, for example, in China or Russia?
I mean, firstly, this was a hole that the global North's political class dug itself, because it is the class that has been walking astride the planet Earth, claiming that it is the paragon of free speech. Okay, I mean, this is something that the West has done through the history of colonialism. They've valorized John Stuart Mill as an example. You know, his treatise on government. John Stuart Mill was a man who owned human beings in Virginia. He was a slave owner. And yet he is valorized to our children who are taught about democracy. They read the second treatise of government as if it's the be-all and end-all of democratic thinking. At the same time, the US Constitution was written by men who owned other human beings. In other words, they were slave owners. And that has been lifted up, and we are told that Constitution is the be-all and end-all. I mean, I'm smiling as I talk to you, and the reason I'm smiling is that this is not a question of hypocrisy. I'm smiling because this is indeed the contradiction of the Western claim of superiority, of Western civilization's claim. Indeed, the idea of Western civilization was invented during the era of colonialism. While you are out there behaving like a barbarian, you are calling the people you're brutalizing barbarians. That's exactly what King Leopold of Belgium did in the Congo. That's exactly what the Dutch did in Indonesia, what the British did all over the world, the French did all over the world. You are behaving like barbarians and you're calling other people barbarians. I mean, come on, guys. There's something ridiculous in that history of liberal thought and so on. Okay, that's one thing. Secondly, in the aftermath of World War II, the Western countries began to call themselves the zone of freedom. They used the word free with everything. You know, they said that this is where freedom is, and the other side of the Iron Curtain is unfreedom, authoritarian, and so on, and they are free and whatnot. Well, during the US civil rights movement, when people like Bull Connor of Birmingham had dogs released against young Black children who were peacefully trying to go to school and so on, photographs of that used to be put on the photographs of that, of these children being brutalized, used to be shown on the front page of Soviet newspapers. Left-wing newspapers around the world used to carry that, sort of indicating this, this double history. On the one side, you keep claiming you are the bastions of democracy, free speech, and then this. Again, it's not hypocrisy. It's that both these things are true. It could be true that you could have a good constitution, and at the same time, this is what you do. It's not hypocritical. Both things are true at the same time. You see, hypocrisy is when you say something and do something else. That actually lets the West off the hook, because then it says, well, why don't you live up to how you claim? In fact, what I'm saying is that the global North could never live up to how it claimed, because to do that would have to undermine the forms of wealth extraction from the working people and the poor. In fact, it was impossible to live up to your ideals because of the nature of your society. You follow, it's not hypocritical. Hypocrisy actually can be undone. That, Dimitri, why are you saying you're a nice guy when you're behaving like this? You can behave like a nice guy. That's hypocrisy, where you say one thing and behave another way. But if you cannot live up to your ideals, it's not hypocrisy. It's the nature of your system. And that's exactly what the West has been like for its entire history. You'd have to undo colonialism and slavery to live up to your constitutions. And because you couldn't, because that was a form of wealth extraction, you were always going to have this doubleness, this high, minded sense of yourself, and this brutal river of blood that's flowing under your feet. These two things are both true at the same time. And indeed, this is exactly not only the history, but the current situation, that on the one side, the West continues to say, we believe in free speech, and it will continue to beat people up. Why? Because both these things are true. Both this commitment to free speech as a weapon to beat other people who they claim are not committed to free speech, and you cannot allow free speech in your own society, because if those who speak freely, and by the way, I don't believe that these encampments are merely, and I'm sorry to use the word merely, or only about Palestine. They are also about the fact that millions of young people in Western countries look ahead and say, we have no future, we have precarious jobs, we are carrying vast amounts of student debt. There's a reason why they are disgruntled. It's not only about the Palestinian cause. They are standing, in a sense, for themselves as well. I want to insist on that, that this is not a protest only for Palestine. It's for Palestine, certainly, but it's also their utter disgust at their own societies and their own leaders,
Right.
which is why they have captured this doubleness that you say this, but we live like this. And you cannot change the way we have to live, because to change this debt-ridden society, this precarious work, is the end of you. And in fact, we want the end of you. And I
Right.
think this is the direction it's going in.
I couldn't agree more, Vijay. I think that this is precisely why the reaction to these protests by the political elites and the establishment in the United States has been so aggressive and so severe, because at a certain level they understand that this is more broadly a challenge to the status quo, not simply a challenge to Israeli government policy towards Israel. And I think this is a good segue into the next question I wanted to ask you. Yesterday, in a blog post entitled "The Students Will Not Tolerate Hypocrisy," you wrote the following: "For a long time now, young people in the US, as in other countries of the global north, have felt the demise of promise from their society. Permanent precarious work awaits them. Even those with higher degrees and a more precious hold on morality has developed within them due to their own experiments to become better humans in the world. Cruelties of austerity and of patriarchal norms have forced them to turn against their ruling classes. They want something better. The assault against Palestinians has spurred a rupture. How much further these young people will go is yet to be seen." Now, about 13 years ago, a popular uprising that came to be known as Occupy Wall Street swept across the Western world in the wake of the great financial crisis. I personally was quite taken up by that movement. I remember traveling from, I left my work as a partner in a law firm in Canada for several days. I went down to New York City's Zuccotti Park. I visited the encampments. I participated in protests in Manhattan. And within days of my departure, it was all gone. All of it swept away by police brutality. And there was a wave of police brutality that befell the Occupy encampments across not just the United States, but also in Canada. And almost as swiftly as this movement had arisen, it evaporated, it vanished, at least on the surface. And some of that energy, we could argue, was channeled into other movements. It never actually went away, but the movement itself was extinguished by a wave of police brutality. My question to you is, do you think this student uprising can avoid that fate? And if so, what will it take, in your view, to avoid that fate?
Well, I'm a very old-fashioned person when it comes to the history of movements. I mean, I'm very pleased that on the one side, I'm a political person, but I also went and studied history, because I have a sense that it's important to take the long view on political change. Change doesn't happen rapidly. Revolutions don't happen in a day. Even the Russian Revolution took years. It took years to build, firstly. The early movements were in the 19th century. And even after 1917, the revolution continued for decades. In fact, then the Soviet Union collapsed and we are where we are, and then God knows where we'll go. And, I don't either feel desolate about the way movements go, or I'm in a hurry. I know it takes time. So Occupy Wall Street comes out of, a movement against globalization, out of frustration with democratic politics. There's a wave that people get radicalized into various social protests. Then that radicalization enters the Democratic Party. Then people get, completely dissatisfied with that. Then they fall out with it. And then they go back to a new social protest, and so on and so forth. Very similar thing happens in Canada, is that, people don't have a political home outside the established forces of the establishment. And so they sort of go in and out of the establishment and frustrate themselves. I mean, in Canada, you have the opportunity not to join the Liberals, but the New Democratic Party, which is a constant headache. You enter it, you get disappointed, you come out, you enter it, you get disappointed, you come out, and so on. I was very interested to see party leader Jagmeet Singh say he completely defends the students in the United States and says in Canada, students have the right to, well, come on, Jagmeet. I mean, you yourself knows, what do you mean by that? In recent years, we have seen Canadian students get smashed up. How the Canadian Mounties behaved when there was a global anti-globalization protest in Montreal. What happened to people there? I mean, I well remember that. So, I mean, it's interesting, this, where then Jagmeet will make that statement and say, look, we are actually, come to us, we are a good home. You go in, you're disappointed, and so on. So Occupy was people also coming out of the disappointment of the Bernie Sanders movement. They went into the Bernie Sanders movement through the fights against college debt and so on. Then they left it, went to Occupy. Then Occupy was smashed by the forces of repression. There was not adequate, this idea of a leaderless movement is very disappointing over time because it doesn't have any force to carry it. So people come out of that frustrated and so on. In the period between Occupy and now, new political forces of the left have grown. Political parties have emerged. Party for Socialism and Liberation, for instance, in the United States, plays a very important role. Things like Code Pink have strengthened their own ranks and their organization. Outside all of that, in the Arab community has grown the Palestinian youth movement, led by young Palestinians, allows all kinds of Arabs to join it. It's a very big movement. Between the Palestinian youth movement and the Party for Liberation and Socialism, they have built an alliance of 30, 40 other organizations. They're very, very organized. This is not a leaderless movement. I mean, yes, the encampments are leaderless. They start with Students for Justice in Palestine, in this campus, that campus. But Students for Justice in Palestine is all students. I just don't know where this is going to go. I know that in late May in Detroit, there's going to be a Palestine meeting where the Palestinian Youth Movement, Party for Social Liberation, they're bringing together a range of forces to Detroit. I don't know what discussions they will have, where this will go forward. But listen, at Occupy, there was never anything like this. There was no, let's hold an Occupy conference in New York, or let's have an Occupy conference in St. Louis. There was nothing like that. But now there is. And therefore, it leads me to believe that the movement has learned something, and something new will happen. Now, they could all be arrested and smashed up and destroyed, but there is learning, and I don't know where exactly this is going to end up. I don't want to be overly optimistic, but I'm not one of those that is sort of perpetually pessimistic, saying, well, this is going to go the way of, X, Y, Z. I think there is some learning. I think there are some organized structures. I am very, very clear, just as you are, that the states in these countries, in the United States, in Canada, and so on, the state is very strong. It's actually much stronger than it was at the time of classical fascism. And these instruments of the state, both to do surveillance, to arrest people, and to go and just beat up mass protests, the power of the state is so grotesque now and used for such ill that it's hard to be entirely optimistic about the way forward for a movement. The way in which high officials of the United States have been trying to delegitimize the students, saying you are paid by the Russians, and so it's extremely dangerous statements made by people like Nancy Pelosi. Also irresponsible for high officials to talk about their own young people in this way. On the one side, they say we want the youth to be participating. In fact, it's not true. They want the youth to be obedient. They want the youth to come for their events, to be obedient to them. They don't want the youth to actually be political. When the youth are political, they are upset by that. That often happens in intergenerational politics. It's not about the actual character of your politics. It is true intergenerationally that older people get frustrated by younger people, and they'll say, you don't know anything, you don't have any experience, you don't know reality. I'm sure you have thought that sometimes in your head. I've thought that in my head. It's intergenerational. I've experienced older people telling me that. that's all true, but it's imperative upon us, people like us, to also stop that and say that's irresponsible. Let them speak, let them be heard. And I think we are going to see some maturity in the politics of the global north. Politics made immature by people who are in their 70s and 80s, in fact.
I think that also one difference, I too don't pretend to know where this is all going to go. And I dread the idea that it will be extinguished by the forces of repression. But one difference between this situation we're in now and Occupy is that every single day, those students are seeing images of depravity across their iPhone screens and their computer screens. And there's no end in sight to the horrors being inflicted upon the Palestinian people. And I think perhaps the most shocking thing about what we're witnessing is that the perpetrators of these crimes are willfully publishing evidence of their atrocities and even publishing demonstrations that they are reveling in the commission of these atrocities. These types of images are fuel for the fires of rage, and it's hard to imagine that the state could somehow find a way to extinguish those fires, given what we're seeing every day. But before I let you go, Vijay, I wanted to go on to a subject which is different from the one we've been focusing upon, namely the student protests. It is, however, from my perspective, something that is relevant to the whole question of fascism. I've always believed that a key element of fascism is hyper-militarism. And the other day, I saw you talk about a book you've authored called Hyper-Imperialism. And you laid out some very interesting and quite astonishing conclusions about the true levels of military spending in the West. And since I have you here, I wanted to invite you to tell us what your conclusions were, because I think they're really quite an eye-opener.
Yeah, so this text was produced by Tricontinental and Global South Insights, which is a group of experts who are building one of the most interesting databases that I think we'll soon release for public use. It's got all the big databases in one place, and we're using it to establish new kind of information. Okay. Now, most of the time, we have relied on SIPRI, this institute in Stockholm, for world military spending. What SIPRI does, which is fair enough, is they take the government spending, what the government says they are spending for the military at face value, and then they aggregate them all. Yeah, so the US government says, here's what we spend in the Department of Defense. But the problem is the US government buries a lot of its military spending. Give you a very simple example. It buries a lot of the nuclear weapons spending in the Department of Energy. It doesn't talk about the veterans spending, which it buries in the Veterans Affairs budget. So we went and looked at all the totality of the US budget and peeled out all the line items that had to do with the military. So a lot of scrubbing work had to be done. So for instance, 2022, rather than about 900 billion, the actual total of US military spending was 1.53 trillion. So, not exactly double, but near double. When we added up all the spending of different countries, we found something fascinating. See, in this period, it's become commonplace for all kinds of liberal media, including CBC in Canada, all the US media, BBC, and so on. It's become quite common for them to say China is a threat, Russia is a threat, Russia is a great threat to the planet. Okay, let's take that at face value. Now let's look at military spending, which is one arbiter of threat. Because after all, why would you have the military be so big if you're not using it around the world? If you add up the military spending of the United States, the NATO countries, including the US, and NATO plus countries like Japan and Korea, these countries account for 75% of global military spending. Okay, these countries. So the global north accounts for 75% of military spending. United States has 902 military bases around the world. China accounts for 10% of global military spending, Russia for near about 3%. Now, let's add China and Russia up, just because in some quarters of the global north, there's this belief that there's a Chinese-Russian alliance. In fact, there's not. In fact, there is not, because when Russia entered Ukraine, China was under no obligation to come into the battle. They don't have a military treaty. They have a strategic treaty, but not a military treaty, unlike NATO, which is a military pact. So let's add them up 13%, just for fun, okay? Although it's not the correct thing to do. We're comparing 75% of global military spending, a bloc which has actually used nuclear weapons in Japan, a bloc which has actually illegally invaded dozens of countries in the last period itself, okay? Just in the last 10, 12 years, it's illegally invaded dozens of countries. This bloc is not considered to be the largest threat to the planet, but China and Russia, 10, 3, add them together, 13%. China has never really attacked a country outside itself in years. Chinese attacked Vietnam in 1978, okay? That's a very long time. That's the last time China has attacked another country. Attacked Vietnam 1978, long time ago. How is China the greatest threat? How is Russia the greatest threat? Russia and China are defense military powers. Now, that doesn't mean that Russia was not aggressive when it attacked Ukraine in 2022. That was an aggressive move by definition. But an aggressive move when one country attacks another, there have been many aggressive. Currently, Rwanda's proxy group is inside the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That's an aggressive move. They attacked. Nobody talks about Rwandan imperialism. You know, these aggressive things happen all the time on the planet. Countries send troops across the border. The government of Ecuador aggressively entered the Mexican embassy to go and capture Jorge Glass just weeks ago. These are aggressive things to do. Countries behave aggressively. Okay, that happens. But there's a big difference between aggression and imperialism. There is no Chinese imperialism or Russian imperialism. Our material in the hyper-imperialism text shows that. There is no basis to make those arguments. There is one imperialism, and it's the global north's very dangerous behavior around the planet. You know, as Chomsky used to say, there's the greatest terrorist force on the planet is the United States government. And he didn't say morally. He didn't say that rhetorically. He actually meant it, in fact, realistically, that there is one country that sows terror around the world. It illegally bombed Iraq to such an extent that maybe 2 million people died. It went in there and ravaged Afghanistan, destroyed the Libyan state, and so on and so forth. It has sown terror among the world's people. Simple as that. It's not a moral. You know how people say, you are a terrorist or you are a fascist in a moral way. Chomsky didn't use the word morally. I've had a long discussion with him on this. I asked him, you know, unlike you to be such a moral person, he says nothing moral about it. This is just plainly scientific. The word terrorist comes from the word terror, which is the biggest power that has sown terror among more people around the world. Well, the United States. Well, in that regard, it's a scientific use of the term. And you know, Noam Chomsky, he doesn't fool around with words. He's a linguist, after all.
Well, Vijay, it's been a great pleasure talking to you. I just want to say one thing before I let you go. You broke up a moment ago, and I think we didn't hear your description of Russia's aggression in terms of Ukraine. I think that you referred to it as a defensive power, if I understood correctly.
Yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, look, Russia didn't attack Ukraine in order to go and seize Ukrainian territory. This conflict taking place in Ukraine goes back decades. In fact, it's quite interesting. After the Soviet Union collapsed, I was a young person, I was quite surprised that such a large territorial unit collapsed with so little violence. You know, how is it possible that Georgia, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, all of them, declared independence? There was no violence. Well, in fact, there was no violence really in most of the ridge, the kind of border areas of the USSR. But that violence was put off, because it's not that there was no violence. 91, there was no violence. The struggle with Georgia was delayed by a decade. It starts in 2007-8, more than a decade. And the struggle over Ukraine's delimited borders goes from about 2012-13, when this gets put on the table by the Ukrainian government, who start an anti-Russian policy, social policy. That starts in the eastern region of Ukraine. So, Russia acts partly, in a way, it's out there trying to kind of to settle the collapse of the Soviet Union's borders. That's one of the issues. Secondly, NATO advances eastward at a rapid clip, bringing nuclear weapons closer to the Russian and the Chinese border. China with Taiwan, and here in Belarus, in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and in Ukraine. And then when Donald Trump unilaterally leaves the mid-range missile treaty, this actually terrified both the Chinese and the Russians. And that's why you see heated up conflicts in Taiwan and in Ukraine. This is these countries wanting to defend themselves from the terrorist attack by the United States, because it would place mid-range nuclear weapons within 12, 13 minutes flight time of the capital cities of both countries. If they placed mid-range nuclear weapons in Ukraine, it could hit Moscow in under 15 minutes. If they put mid-range nuclear weapons in Taiwan, it would strike Beijing in even less than that, closer to 10 minutes. And this is this is something that concerns them. And hence, China and Russia have been behaving like defensive powers, nothing offensive about their behavior. Yes, aggressive to cross the border into Ukraine, but still that aggression comes in the context of trying to defend Russia against the aggressions of the West.
Well, thank you very much, Vijay. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today. I hope we'll have an opportunity to continue the conversation in the future. And this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece on May 3rd, 2024.